nothing worse than doing a presentation and not recording.
Which I've never done before, have I?
No, me neither.
Good morning, good evening. How are you?
I'm
Oh,
good.
we've got
Oh, yeah.
Vous en
David.
avez à la prochaine, du coup.
Okay.
Good evening. I'll be on mute. My wife has a call, so when she finishes, then I can
No
eventually
problem. Thanks, Pete.
unmute.
Good. Hi, David. Hi, Steve. It is 7 o'clock. Thanks for being prompt and on time. It's so lovely to see you. For those that don't know me, I'm Aveline, host of Six Star Leaders Community, and I'm hosting this event on behalf of my esteemed colleague, Rob Drummond. And we'll just wait another minute and allow a few more people to join us before we get started. While we're waiting, it would be great just to know where you're dialing in from. You want to pop in the chat where you are right now. I'm in Australia, not that you would have guessed from my accent, and it is evening, 7 p.m. here. And I am on the Gold Coast in Australia. And I can see one of my neighbours here on the call who just lives up the road, not too far. Let's see who we got. Sunshine Coast. Hello. Look at that. Burley Heads, Germany. David's in South Brittany in France. My daughter is moving to France next year. Was going to be this year. Now it's next year. So I'll be going to France at some point in my near future. All right, we're going to get started at 7:02, and we've got a few people coming in now. 7:02 is the magic time. All right, let's go. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us to the Storytelling Boomerang. It's a live masterclass with Rob. I am the host. My role here is simply to introduce him and to kick things off, which I'll do now. With a bit of housekeeping, I always remind people, please to put your phone on silent. Also, notifications, those notifications on the computer, if you could turn those off, and your phone as well, just in case, because as we go through, you might be on off mute if it's a time to share, because Rob will take us through a number of exercises where he'll ask the room to share, and reflect, etc. You'll get that when we get there. But yeah, just remember to turn off notifications. Wait for the question break before asking questions, or just put them in the chat as you go. So if there's something that pops up as Rob's talking and teaching and you don't want to forget it, either write it down, or a question, put it in the chat, and he'll get to it when we get to that section. Be ready to share, expand your thinking. You don't have to. It's not mandatory that you do share. However, it'd be great if something comes up that you would be open and willing to share. And of course, be open to the possibilities of becoming you, as in learning more about you. And this workshop, having gone through it myself previously, it is one that will help you to get back in touch with yourself and explore probably parts of yourself you may have forgotten, or just left in the past in a cupboard somewhere. But it's a lot of fun. So also have fun as we go. We'll be sticking to the time, and given that we've done this workshop before, it will run we've said 90 minutes. We'll finish before then. We totally respect your time, so we won't go beyond that. And yeah, I think that's it for housekeeping. Now, Rob, my introduction. This is in his own words. He is many things, amongst others. He's a father of two, a barefoot runner, longbow archer, craft beer drinker. He's a copywriter, ads manager, and marketing automation expert. He's a lot more than that, I can tell you. But he's certainly qualified, and he's really an expert at what he's going to teach you. And it's something that I've actually never heard anybody teach before. And I've been working in this space, I guess, of marketing automation since 2008. And so Rob is very unique in what he does. So I think that's about it. Now I'm going to hand over to Rob. I'm going to stop sharing and welcome you, and I'll go on mute And I ask that everyone else just please mute yourself whilst Rob does his magic.
Thanks, Av. One sec, let me share my presentation. If you can just give me a heads up when you can see the Storytelling Boomerang slide. Good. I just wanted to build on something you were saying there, Av. I sometimes quote Terry Pratchett, fiction author, who said that he reckoned that writing was the most fun you can have by yourself. I think that storytelling is the most fun you can have in marketing, and it should be fun. So give yourself permission to do it. Allow it some space. It's one of those things that can easily sit. It's an important but non-urgent item that can sit on your to-do list for months and months, and you get busy with other things. So just allow it a bit of space, because it is fun and it can be valuable. Well, in this masterclass, I want to explain how valuable it can be. The tension that I think we're looking to solve here is that you are in a category of one. You know you're in a category of one. There is no one else in the world who does exactly what you do in the way that you do it, provides the results you provide in the same timescales, in the same way. But you're not perceived as a category of one. When potential clients encounter you or encounter your marketing, they put a broad brush label on what you do, which has elements of truth, but it doesn't really capture your genius, your uniqueness. So that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to take people from that point of understanding to the point of understanding where they see your genius and have put you in a category of one, so that when the time is right, assuming they have the problem that you solve and the money to pay for it, when the time is right, they only want to work with you. They're not, looking around for other providers. So you're on the right masterclass. I'm aware that asking you to commit 90 minutes out of your day if you're a solopreneur is a big ask. I am going to do my best to make that worth your time, but you're on the right masterclass, as I just said. If you want to be seen as unique, if you want potential clients to get what you're all about, because at the moment, when you get face to face with people and you have that in-depth conversation, they do get it, but you can't have that face-to-face conversation with everyone that you might meet online or that might be interested in your services. So how do we automate that process at scale? You're on the right masterclass if every time you tell some of your story in your marketing, you feel or you worry that you're being self-indulgent, you're maybe being irrelevant, you're perhaps distracting people from your sales message. Because here's the rub, is that telling your story is actually a less direct route to your proposition. If you're telling your story, you're not using that space to talk about your features and your benefits and your offer, and all of those things do have a place. So I think there's a leap of faith required to be brave and tell some of your story before introducing your offer. Because I think what you'll find by doing that is that the people who respond to your offer do get you a lot more. You perhaps also worry that nobody is really interested in your story. You think people are mostly interested in themselves, not in you. There is, of course, some degree of truth in this, but it's not the entire truth. I think there's quite a lot to unpack here, isn't there, where we're almost conditioned by society to perceive that our story isn't of interest, doesn't matter. We haven't done all of the things that people have done in movies or whatever. But actually, I think for someone who is looking at working directly with you, they are very interested in your story and knowing that they can trust you and knowing that your word is what it says it is. So just quickly, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Rob Drummond. I run a business called the Storytelling Lab, which is my story copywriting agency and training business. I help coaches, consultants, and educators to tell their story and be seen as the experts they really are. Within that, I'm mostly known for LinkedIn ads and content marketing. We'll touch a little bit on LinkedIn ads today, but mostly we'll be looking at content. We're looking at taking people who've already opted in and building deeper, stronger, more authentic connections. A bit like you would do offline, we're trying to build those authentic connections online so that they feel like they know the real you. Outside of work, I'm also a barefoot runner. There's a story behind that, which I'll share in a little bit. I'm sorry to say that these are my feet. This is my local park where I go running in the temperate months, just about still in the temperate months at the moment. And this is my family. So I have one wife and two kids, and my kids take up a lot of my time, and that's great. So okay, so what is the story? The storytelling boomerang, and why have I called it this? So in my modeling, when people first encounter you, when people first opt in, so they opted on day zero here, which is the point at which you start the relationship, you start your communications, you start your email sequences, you throw the boomerang in a sense. When people first encounter you, this isn't really the place to share your life story, because if you lead with your life story at this point, and usually this is almost before people have opted in, maybe they've seen a LinkedIn post or a Facebook post, and I've seen quite a lot of these, and it's someone sharing their life story of how broke they were, 4 years ago, and then they discovered this simple secret, and just for the exchange of your email address, they'll share this with you. And it's obviously they're using storytelling as a hack, not as an authentic mode of communication. So in my modeling, the initial messaging that we're using, both in terms of maybe ads that you're putting out, or maybe the very first emails that go out, maybe relying less on storytelling and being a bit more direct, being a bit more problem-led, because you can only really get someone's attention by talking about the problem that they currently have and showing them that you actually understand the problem at hand better than they do. However, if you only ever talk about these things, if you only ever talk about the problem that you solve, if you only ever talk about features and benefits, then it's impossible for them to put you in a category of one, because ultimately everyone has good features, or every good business, every well-established business has good features, good benefits. And the risk is that you just end up sounding like every other marketer. And you might have noticed this if you've had weeks or months where you've really worked on your marketing, and you come to the end of it and you look back and it's like, well, does it really sound like you? Or does it just make you sound like another marketer? That's probably a good question to ask yourself. So in the storytelling boomerang, what I want to do is, over the first 14 days that people are opted into your world, you want to start by talking about the problem, but then give them a little tour of your story. And obviously your story, we all have big stories. We've all been around the sauna a few times, and you've done various things. So we want to take a selective tour around your story. The difficulty, I think, that people often have in telling their story is because it's too big. So it's knowing what stories to tell, in what order, in what places, and how to tell them in a way that still connects to your message. Because you never want to lose sight of the sales message. You never want to lose sight of the message that you're trying to communicate, that you're trying to illustrate to people by telling your story. Because if you lose sight of the message, the boomerang doesn't come back. You just chuck it off into a field somewhere, or into a river or something. So the boomerang still has to come back to you. So on days 10 to 14, as rough kind of guidance. I mean, obviously the number of days is a rule of thumb in here. But by sort of days 10 to 14, we want people to be coming back, and we're now being much more focused on the solution. We're presenting them with an offer. We're putting a next step in front of them. In terms of your systems then, this is what it mostly looks like in my system and when I implement this for clients. So potential clients move from left to right. I should add that for anyone with a systems background, I'm not using these icons in the ways that they were intended. But if you can overlook that, people opt in on the left, and generally they will opt in for one or more lead magnets. I've put 3 in here because it might be that you have a few different lead magnets in your archive that people can opt in for to begin solving a particular problem with you. The lead magnet should solve a subset of the full problem that you solve for people when they work with you directly. You're isolating some fraction of that. If you think about the problem that you solve as a pie chart, the lead magnet solves a sliver. It allows them to get started, but it doesn't solve the full problem. And you might have different slivers of the pie chart that are different lead magnets. It might be that you just have one. In my business, I kind of just have one. It's a mistake, I think. So obviously when people respond to your lead magnets, they opt in for your lead magnet. They might end up on a thank you page on your website. A lot of people are then putting time-based offers on those thank you pages. So thanks for opting in for my lead magnet. Book a call with me to discuss whatever problem it is that you solve. I mean, you can do that. My experience doing that was that I found that a lot of people who opted in for the lead magnet did respond to the time-based offer at this point. But my no-show rate was quite high for those calls. And my close rate from those calls was still quite low because they didn't actually yet know me. They were often kind of agency hopping clients who just wanted to know how much I charge. And just telling your story in your marketing also has the effect of pushing away people that are a bad fit for you. People who don't share your values actually won't be interested in your story. And those are the people who aren't great to work with. So there's this kind of qualification in and qualification out mechanism as well. So the first email sequence that I suggest you create after people opt in, and I mark this as E1, is where you deliver the lead magnet that they've opted in for. So again, we're not being very story-led at this point. We're delivering the lead magnet, and then you might have a 3-day sequence, assuming that only 20% of the people are going to download the lead magnet, let alone read it. I would draw on some of the key points in your lead magnet and say, have you thought about it from this angle? Have you thought about the problem this way? This was what we experienced when we solved the problem for this client under these circumstances. And then you refer back to the lead magnet. The other thing you can do here is if you have multiple lead magnets, what I do in my sequence is on day 1, I deliver them the lead magnet that they opted in for. On day 2, I actually deliver a second lead magnet that solves the problem from a slightly different way. So you can actually start to drip in multiple lead magnets in here. And you're trying to give people your best stuff. You're trying to, at this point, we're still focused on the problem and we're trying to pour cement around the relationship. At the end of your 3 days here, you then want to place a service offer. And for most of my clients, this is a time-based offer. It's inviting people to book a call. It's inviting people to, it could even be inviting people to join a webinar. It could be a product. It could be, a course or something, but for most of my clients, it's time-based. I've seen a great improvement in the quality of my calls by just delaying the service offer to after this sequence. This sequence that really acts as a litmus test of, do you really have the problem that I'm solving here? Is this of pressing importance to you? Because if it's of pressing importance, they will read this sequence. They will engage with this sequence. And they're much more likely to show up when they actually book a call with you at this point. So what this is doing is, if you think about everyone who opts into your world, there is a buying market, so people who are ready right now, and then there is usually a much bigger waiting market of people who are interested in your topic but are not ready to buy yet. Maybe the time isn't right, they don't have the money, they don't have the decision-making capability, etc. So we then want to nurture the waiting market. So this service offer is to cater to the buying market. It's like, okay, who's ready right now? Who's ready to go? Because some portion of those people will be. Because we're never looking to delay the sale. We're always looking to move people forwards when they're ready. After this service offer, then what you're doing is, what I recommend you do is add people to your lead incubator sequence, which is a 7 to 10 day sequence that tells more of your story, that allows people to get to know the real you. And that's what we'll look at the structure of this in a moment. At the end of this 7 to 10 days, I would then repeat the service offer just to see, okay, who actually does have the problem but just didn't trust you yet? Because then that's what you're doing at this. You're kind of shaking the tree at this point as well to see, okay, who's now ready and trusts me enough to respond to the time-based offer. After that, you want to move people onto your ongoing communications. So what I do with most of my clients is I get them to produce some kind of new marketing, whether that's a podcast, whether that's an article, whatever it looks like, on a fortnightly basis. And that's the ongoing stuff over here. Every 2 weeks, there's a fresh article that gets published onto a LinkedIn newsletter and gets sent out to the email list. What I then do with my clients is I automate the best ones of those into an automated sequence here that goes out at higher frequency. so that after the lead incubator, they receive your best content at higher frequency until they're caught up or until they're up to date, and then they fall into the fortnightly schedule. This is, of course, only one way of doing this. And actually, the more leads you have coming through, the more you can then start to segment this. It might be that you start to segment the flow by services people are interested in, or maybe you segment the flow by interest. How often do they open and click on your emails? And perhaps you treat those people differently. But this is the starting point. I've kind of worked in marketing automation long enough to know that people tend to over automate before the foundations are in place. So this is like the foundation of automating the best version of you. So just a few examples of what that might look like. So on day 0, for most of the clients that I work with, we're running LinkedIn ads. And I've had a lot of success in the last couple of years running LinkedIn conversation ads, which are LinkedIn sponsored messaging ad format. So this is a screenshot of my control ad from earlier in the year where I offer my LinkedIn conversation ad template pack. And you'll notice here that this follows the what I call the problem-led approach. It says, hi so-and-so, have you dabbled with the idea of running paid social ads, but I've heard it could be monstrously expensive. So again, that's the problem. And then I've said, frankly, it can be expensive if you follow the platform's budget recommendations, if you spend money on ineffective ad formats. That's kind of sticking the knife in a bit more. It can be bad if you do these things. There are only a small number of ad formats you should consider. In the last 12 months, some of my clients have cut their cost per lead by more than 80% by switching to the conversation ad format. So that's then the mechanism of how that I'm then introducing the mechanism. This message is a conversation ad. It shows up in the inbox as a sponsored message. So there's a curiosity element. Every time you use the word this is a curiosity element. I then got my call to action here. Would you be interested in receiving a free copy of my conversation ad template? The template outlines 3 possible approaches to writing your ads. One is the problem-led approach, which this message uses. So again, we've got that curiosity element. But just to reiterate this, I've not seen huge success by telling your story here. I would generally lead with the problem and showing that you really understand the problem in the language that they're currently using in their head. That's generally what has generated the best response. When they opt in for my conversation ad template pack, I then have a 3-day email sequence, which if you don't have this in place, could just start off being a 1-day sequence. I think optimally it's probably 3 days because you can pinpoint different things in the lead magnet. But you could just start off with a 1-day sequence. So 1 day is here is your minimum viable product. So as we discussed, there could be a call to action point on day 3 or at the end of the sequence. Could be a time-based offer or webinar/events. So yeah, days 4 to 14 are now our lead incubator sequence where we're mixing in more personal stories. Again, we've got our time-based offer at the end of this. This is an example of the automated greatest hits sequence that I had running for a client who's using Go High Level. So at the end of the lead incubator, we then add them to a sequence where we send some of our best articles out once a week. So our fresh articles go out every fortnight because writing and publishing every fortnight is a nicer production schedule. If you're also busy, you're running a business, you have some time to write, but not that much time. So you can send fresh articles every 2 weeks, but then after people have received your story, you can queue them up at higher frequency until they've caught up. So it's a fairly simple sequence. And you can see actually that there's 26 people waiting at this point, 18 people waiting at this point, and they go on down through the sequence until they get caught up. The emails that we're sending at this point, I would say, are more of a mix of story and content. For this client, each email here is effectively an article, but she is very good at being story-led and finding a story to illustrate the point that she's making in the article and making that a personal story. And she gets good feedback based on that. I think the reason to do this also is to avoid what I heard a guy called Chris L. Davis call this the creator's curse, where you're always creating more and more marketing. And all of us have limited time to create marketing. And I think there's actually a big payoff in being more savvy about how you reuse your best marketing from the past. This is a whole in pretty much every business that I, speak to on a consulting basis. Once people are in this kind of greatest hit sequence, the call to action points can vary. It could be that you include a call to action on every message. I think it's better to include a bigger, more prominent call to action every month or so. Otherwise, people kind of just become blind to it if it's in every message. So I want to just spend 10 minutes or so really looking at the structure of the lead incubator, because this is the sequence in between when people are first opted in, you've begun solving the problem for them, and before they start receiving your greatest hits and your ongoing communications. This is where they get to know the real you. So in my sequence, when I first created this, I took a bit of a tour of my own story, which is always harder to do. Like, the hardest story to work on is your own. It's much easier for me to work with a client and to get them talking about their story, and then I come away from it and go, oh yeah, you should tell this, 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 and this. It's much harder to work on your own story. So if thinking about your own story feels like a lot of work, then trust me, you're not alone on that one. But when I first created this sequence, it had 18 stories in, and over time, what I've done is I've whittled that down to 10 stories. And I've also asked, if you look at stories from literature and the great stories, even plays from ancient Greece, most stories follow what you might call the 3-act structure, where you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what the beginning, middle, and end does is so the beginning is where you present the subject. In the hero's journey, this is the call. It's the call for the protagonist to go on the quest and go on the journey. In the middle, you have the revision, the internal growth, the internal character change that the protagonist needs to go through in order to solve the problem that the story is posing. And then the final act is the resolution. It's how things work out. Things either go back to how they were or better. And we're left with the moral of the story. So I was like, okay, looking at my stories, how can I slot them into this 3-act structure? And then is there a formula? Because, as I've said, pinpointing stories to tell in your marketing is difficult because you've got so many different stories, and it's often hard to see the relevance of any individual story to your current business and your current line of work. It's actually much more helpful to have some constraints. If I ask you to think of a story that demonstrates the inciting incident where you first felt compelled to start your current business, that's a helpful constraint, because it means that you're now, rather than thinking about your story as a huge big blob, you're now got a much more laser focused on one particular thing. And if you pose this question to yourself at bedtime and leave your subconscious brain to think about it overnight, for me, usually at 4 a.m, my subconscious brain will send a story up to the surface of what that story is I need to be telling. So it can be quite helpful to have some constraints on the story selection process. So I wanted to just talk you through the stories that I've got in my sequence, because listening to the outline of my stories will give you some ideas on, it might make one of your own stories come up to the surface as well. So on day 1 of the lead incubator, I'm telling a story that, again, we're still trying to be problem focused at this point. So I'm telling a story that demonstrates the problem. So I've got a story here from my first job, where I worked on Sundays as an outdoor worker at a local garden centre. And at Christmas, we used to sell Christmas trees. And there were 4 Sunday lads working outside. So, of course, because it was cold and we had nothing better to do, we used to compete to see who could sell the most Christmas trees. And I always came bottom in this little internal competition. I didn't have the gift of the gab. I used to pull out a bunch of trees and be like, that one's got a nice shape. I also accidentally elbowed a customer in the head once by pulling a tree through the netting machine, and some customer had walked behind me to ask about compost or roses or something. And the tree came through at once, and I elbowed her in the head. So I didn't sell that many trees. I assaulted some more customers than I ought to have done. But the lesson that I was left with was that I wasn't a salesperson. I didn't have the gift of the gab. And actually, I think this is a problem in marketing, is that we think we need to have this way with words, whereas actually, I think you just need to show up as yourself. My controlling idea story is a story from a 6-month trip I made to South America in 2009. At the end of my trip, I was in Colombia on the Caribbean coast, traveling between Cartagena and Santa Marta. Halfway through, a bus conductor came on and said, "Oh, cambio, 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 change buses." And I'd relaxed. I'd taken all my stuff off, and I clambered off the bus. The bus is driving away. I pat my chest where my money belt usually is, containing my passport, my credit cards, my life, and it's not there. And I've left it on the bus. So I went and spoke to the next bus conductor, who said, "Get on. We'll make some phone calls for you." So I got on this bus, and I'm sitting there watching the sun go down. I can't see her making any phone calls, thinking, "Oh no, I'm going to have to borrow some money somehow. I'm going to have to spend 20 hours trying to get to the embassy in Bogota to beg for a passport." And we got to Santa Marta. We were the last people on the bus. She said, "Espera, wait a minute." And then she reappeared holding my money belts. And she got another bus company to search the bus, send it to Santa Marta, and I got it back that night. So for me, that story is about trust, and trust is my controlling idea. The controlling idea is like the boundary. If you think about a cricket pitch, the controlling idea is the boundary rope that goes around your work. So it's thinking about a story that illustrates what is that controlling idea. The wounding event for me, and I would put it to you that we all have wounding events of some sort, because that is what it means to be human. And sometimes these are obvious, sometimes these seem trivial, but my story probably falls into the latter category. When I was in high school in year 8, I had a very fearsome French teacher who was about 4'7" with the loudest voice in the school. And she always asked me to read first. She'd be like, "Robert, can you read from page 27 in the textbook?" And then one day I started reading, and it was, I don't know what happened, but I just couldn't read. I remember the sentence. The sentence started off "Simatan," blah, 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 and I just couldn't say the words. And I stammered over it a few times. And then all the other boys in the class laughed. And then there was this silence. And she asked me to read again, and I couldn't. And then we got out onto the yard at break or recess a bit later, and a mate came over to me and said, "Yeah, that was quite good, Rob, pretending to stammer so that you didn't have to talk." And I was like, "Yeah, that's what's happened." And for about 15 years, the stammering thing haunted me. Still haunts me today, really. Just this morning, my son Hugo has asked me to start reading Harry Potter to him, and I realized that actually it's still there. I've just had to learn to deal with it. I also don't think it's a massive coincidence that my work today is about communicating your most authentic self and being able to communicate. Whether that's being driven by things that have happened in the past, I don't know, but it's worth just exploring because it might help. I think the questions that we solve in our work are actually quite deep rooted often. So often you want to try to go back to the beginnings of those roots. In my lead incubator, so I wanted to, when I was thinking about this, I was trying to analyze which of the stories are more personal and which of the stories are more business related. And I realized that the 3 stories I placed in Act 1 were quite personal stories about me studying at school, losing my money belts, working in a garden center. They were, yeah. So I think it's natural for these stories early on to be more personal in nature. Email 4 then is my inciting incident. And for me, that was deciding to set out a business by myself, assuming it would be easy. My first business was selling SMS text messaging services to local businesses who just didn't want that. And one day I walked into a hair salon in Beaconsfield and asked him, "Oh, can I speak to you about text messaging?" And he said, "Well, no, my accountant already deals with my taxes, thanks." And I said, "No, not taxes, text messaging, like on your phone." And he says to me, "Well, I don't think I need that, but can you get me ranked on Google in the Google rankings?" And I kind of yawned as nonchalantly as I could and said, "Yeah, I probably can." And that was my route into business. That was how I initially became a Google Ads consultant and started managing ads. And I still manage ads today. I manage LinkedIn ads for my clients, and that was the inciting incident there. The false start then is you set off in business and you think you've cracked it, and you haven't cracked it because you haven't yet learned enough about yourself. So for me, my false start was growing a small Google Ads agency and working with an assistant and starting to scale things out. And the advice that I was getting was build a team, build an agency, scale things up, build processes. And I started to realize that actually I was losing clients because I was generating conversions for these clients. And then, I'd lose clients because the clients would phone me up and say, we're really sorry, Rob, but these conversions haven't turned into business. So we're going to have to end the project. And I was banging my head on the wall. I was like, well, why? Like, did you not phone them up? Did you not email them? Did you not have systems in place? And I realized that I needed much more control over the full sales process. So that was my false start. The key incident, the thing that I realized, so because of this urge to control more of the sales process, I ended up becoming a certified partner of a tool called Infusionsoft. And Infusionsoft used to do an annual user conference. And I went over, and I remember sitting on the tarmac on the plane thinking, damn, I'm in trouble here. Like, I'm doing too many things. When people are going to ask me what I do, and I'm a Google Ads consultant, I'm a copywriter, I'm a marketing automation guy, I'm a direct response marketing consultant. It's too many things. And the key insight that I learned from that was listening to Gary Vaynerchuk talk on the final day. Not a huge Gary V fan, but he said something that stuck with me. He said, all of you sitting there in the audience doing 7 different things need to stop, pick one, and start winning. I was like, okay, that's why I flew 2,000 miles to hear. The grounding principle story then is a story that illustrates the things that you live and die by. So in my sequence here, I've got a story of how I got into barefoot running, which is really an act of complete desperation because I'm a runner. I kept on getting injured. I kept on getting shin splints, runner's knee, things like that. I kept on going to physios who told me to just take more ibuprofen because it was a shortage of ibuprofen that was causing my knees to get sore. And then I went to one physio, and almost as a throwaway comment, he said, you don't see Kenyans and Ethiopians limping off running tracks. And it's because they spend more time barefoot growing up. And running barefoot conditions your foot and your lower leg to land, absorb, and transition into the upward spring. And as soon as he said those words, I could feel them to be true. And then so I remember the first time I went barefoot running was in a muddy park in Sheffield. I'm wondering what on earth I'm doing. But then you do a bit of running and you feel this connection to the floor. You have this kind of grounding experience. And I had this kind of memory that I'd always been running barefoot. I just kind of forgotten it. I've since discovered that there's a bit of science behind that with the grounding effect and the earth being positively charged and so on. But it's the principle of connection. It's an authentic connection. It's authentic movements. And that extends to my work today. The self-awareness story was a story about me traveling to Chicago to work with Perry Marshall, who's a Google Ads and direct marketing consultant. I'm involved in Perry's world and have been for a while. Sometimes get invited to work at his events in the capacity of a copywriter. And I went over to this event in Chicago. I had a tremendous quest to get there in the first place. And we're sitting there in this room, and my job is to spit out copy ideas, headlines, different hooks, different things we might test in ads. And I can't do it fast enough. And then elsewhere in the room, people are having their businesses pulled apart, having the Rubik's Cube spun, businesses are being put back together. And I realized that I can't do that. That isn't my skill. My skill is actually being a holistic connector of narrative dots and seeing, okay, these are the stories that you need to tell in these places in your marketing. That's my genius, and I should stick to that. So there's a story about how have you got into a business situation potentially and discovered that that wasn't your main gig, that wasn't your main skill. In the third act, then we're then demonstrating the outcome and showcasing your vision for the future. So this is the story that is the most expected. that people expect you to tell, of talking about the outcome and the results that you provide. So I've got a story in here about how I got specifically into LinkedIn conversation ads and the difference in results that I've experienced from the previous messaging ad format. So that's the most expected story in here. I've then got my vision for the future, which is a story about the birth of my son and my daughter, who were both born premature, and spending time in the neonatal intensive care unit, and realizing that there was a huge degree of documentation and collaboration between the people who work in those intensive care units. And I realized that marketing could work more like that. It could be more collaborative, with people knowing what they're good at, knowing what they specialize in, and better collaborating with other people. So yeah, so these stories, I felt in hindsight, these stories were more direct in terms of being more directly relevant to my current business and my line of work. So often the more direct stories, I think, go in the act two in the revision. These are the different jobs that you've had. These are the wrong turns that you've made. You know, they generally go in the middle of this sequence. Hopefully that's given you a few ideas of stories that you might want to think about. I'm going to ask Evelyn to share a story too. Again, just because listening to other people's stories will cause some of yours to come to the surface. You've heard some of mine, or the outline of some of mine at least. So, Av, if you're okay sharing a story, as you listen to the story, what I'd like you to do is to think, okay, if you were to distill the essence of the story that I was about to tell you, if you could distill the story to a single word, what is that one word? That's what I'd like you to do.
Thanks, Rob. So full disclosure, Rob helped me with my stories. And you know, I've got them all laid out. So this story starts with me getting sick at the end of a trip in Thailand and sleeping a lot. Spent 3 days asleep in Singapore, landing at Melbourne Airport. I was 19, and I remember being on the plane and having what I believe was a middle ear infection, and I was in so much pain. By the time we landed, they had to call for a medic, and they rushed me through. And all I can really remember, because it was all very, very dramatic, was seeing someone, the passport, everything, my bags were all got for me. My mum was there to pick me up, and literally I was rushed through. And my mum was a nurse, and so she spoke with the medic, and she actually drove me straight to a hospital. This started about 3 weeks of investigation into my health that just continued to decline. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. So literally, I had no energy. And after about a week, so I couldn't work. I had a part-time job at the time, and I was at university. And I couldn't work. I could literally just kind of move around the house, but I was always just so tired. I was just lying on the couches. The first hospital couldn't help. And my mum has worked in a number of departments of a hospital and different career through her career, and knew exactly where to go. And then we ended up going to a infectious diseases hospital, who then ran a barrage of tests, couldn't find anything. They said, no, she's fine. My mum stood there and she said, my daughter has blood pressure that is so low, she should be in a coma. There is something wrong with her, and you can't tell me there's not. They were like, I'm sorry, you know, we can't figure it out. My mum takes me away, and there were days when she would be waking me up on the couch because she was worried that I was falling into a coma, and she was feeding me salt and all this stuff to try and keep me alive. And my parents lived separately, like my parents were divorced, but my dad was into natural remedies, and he had a friend who was a naturopath. And I remember talking, you know, he learned about, of course, my situation. I lived with my mum, and my dad said, let me take you to the naturopath who was out in the country somewhere, and she had this machine that was able to run through the systems of my body And so he picked me up and we drove out there. And the moment I walked up the stairs into her place, she said, "Well, look at you." And I sort of sat down. It was even hard just walking, it was just like, get me a chair, and then I feel like I just want to fall asleep. And the first thing she said when she started to do the testing on me was, "Well, why don't we just dig a hole outside so we can just put you there and we'll fill the hole in, hey? Because you're in the shit. You're in the poo," in her own language. And she went on to then diagnose through her Vega machine a number of things that the infectious diseases hospital and then the first main hospital and then the other doctors my mum had taken me to never picked up. And there was infections, there was typhoid fever, the virus of syphilis, and all this stuff that I'd picked up. And it was really quite dire. And ironically, so after that, she gave me some very horrible tasting medicines and some other things that I started taking. And within 3 days, probably 2 to 3 days, I could actually walk around and my energy started getting back. And within a week, I was back at work. But the interesting thing was, after a few days and I was on the mend, my mum got a phone call from the infectious diseases hospital, and they said, "Oh, we're just calling because we ran the blood tests again, and we actually can see that your daughter needs to come in. She's got all of these things," and they started ticking them off, and my mum went absolutely ape at them, and then ended up putting down the phone because I was on the mend and they'd resolved it. So that is my story, and I came good in the end, but it was not an easy journey, and I had to rely on, of course, the experience of my mum, which was great because she knew a lot and she was not afraid to make tough decisions and speak up to the establishments, but also to my dad, who had the quack doctor on the side, who actually saved my life. So that's my story.
I have a few thoughts about what that story is about. So in the process of distilling the essence of a story to a single idea, it's completely natural to come up with a few different ideas. So for me, the concept of knowing the right people, it's who you know, not what you know, that came up for me quite early on in the story. I was also getting the word depth and really getting to the root cause of an issue. I feel like what the naturopath did was she held up a mirror to you, like a mirror of truth. Um, and the reason that I obviously asked you to share that story is because I think in your work pinpointing people's genius, that's not a huge stretch. If you see how that connects. I just wanted to invite everyone else to just either put in the chat if you come up with either the same ideas as me or even different ideas. It'd be interested to either hear from you directly or just post in the chat. What I call the one idea then is it's your bridge concept between the story and the message. And it's actually very important. It's something that if it's demand, we could even do a follow-up session just on the bridge concept, because having a story and then having a few different distilled ideas of what that story is about gives you a bit of flexibility in how you might use a story, because you can use a story to illustrate different ideas. I also the other thing I wanted to ask you to think about was within the lead incubator structure and within the 10 writing prompts, which of these prompts do you think that story would fit into? It could actually go in a few places. Yeah, so Steve's saying 3, the wounding events. I'm also getting a sense of one in terms of demonstrating the problem, and the problem being that the hospital just send you on your way. um, there is a huge misdiagnosis, and maybe so then misdiagnosis could become the bridge idea into okay, well, many people misdiagnose their marketing, for instance. I've saying could be four, could be one. So four being the inciting incidents. Yeah. So often you've got a bit of flexibility. It's often, these prompts are really meant to get you thinking about specific stories, but often the stories that come up you can move them about a bit. It might be over time that you think of a story that actually sits better in the demonstrating the problem space. So you might move that into a different slot. That's completely natural. My stories have moved about quite a bit. I'd just like to open up the floor really. So obviously there's no requirement to share a story, but if you've been listening along and a particular story has come up from your past that could fit in any one of these, or if you've got questions about how it might fit into one of these, and you've got questions about how the one idea might connect to your message, feel free to share that story with us, and I will listen, and the group will listen, and we'll give you our feedback on what we think that story is about. Any volunteers? No? Okay. As I was saying earlier, obviously this is something to give a little space to, and also to employ your subconscious brain in I was listening to a J.K. Rowling. So because I'm now reading Harry Potter to my son Hugo, I was on J.K. Rowling's website the other night, and she's got a three-part video series called On Writing. That's the same as the book called On Writing. But yeah, she's got a three-part video series, and she was saying that ideas come from. It's like having a lake that ideas come up from. So you've got the lake, which is where inspiration comes from, and then you've got the shed, which is where you take the ideas that come up and you hammer them into shape. And she was saying that some stories are too much lake and not enough shed, and some stories are too much shed and not enough lake. But you do want these ideas to come up. So yeah, David, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I mean, this thing that came up in my mind, especially when you started talking about the roots or the problems that we're trying to solve in our work, go back far. They're deeply rooted, and that really brought up stories of how I grew up as my mum. My mum trying to work as many different jobs at home as she could to support us as a single parent, because my dad just wasn't around and wasn't supporting us. And yet her drive, so she was trying to do that, but also trying to uh, be there for us. She always said, I will be there when you leave to go to school, and I'll be there when you get back." And that was her driving principle. And she always was. She was always there for us. And yet she still had to bring in money. So she was doing I don't know, 3, 4 different jobs that she could around the home. Just to bring in the money, but to make sure that she was there for us. And that's kind of gone on to sort of what I do as a freelancer. My values are, especially now I have a 2-year-old, my values are to be there for him, to be as much as I can and not let work impact that, not have to make those decisions between working and being there for him, because he's the priority. And I can do that because of the type of work I do, working from home, working with multiple clients, having that flexibility to work my schedule. So I think she's a big part of it. And my dad, there's a separate story, I think, for my dad as well there, but that's my mum's the kind of why I do the work I do there, I think. Uh,
Thanks. Just said listening to that, if you pay attention to what David's just said, the last 30 to 40 seconds was him talking about the content of his work. And if he was, say, writing a web page, he could have just talked about that. But I think it was much more powerful by hearing the story first about his mum. Like, it made me feel something a bit more. It's just an observation, but it was story first, content second, with quite a clear connection between the two. The one ideas that came up for me were reliability, commitments, and presence. Although I don't know if I'm getting presence just because you talked about how you're trying to replicate that with your time with your son. Often the thing that you end the story on is the thing that you leave people with. So another thing you can do with your one idea is you can deliberately end the story by mentioning that one idea and then starting your content or your message with the same idea. So if you go and have a look at I put a few links in the chat, and one of them is a link to my lead incubator sequence. If you go and have a look at story 2, which is the Colombian money belt story, the one idea for me in that story was trust. And I've ended, there's a quite distinct point where I end the story by saying something to the effect of, you heard all of these stories in South America about people being robbed, held at gunpoint even. But for me, being robbed and experiencing high levels of trust were never far away. And then it goes on, it says something like, I believe trust is the missing currency, the missing ingredients in marketing in the 21st century. So trust is the glue that ties the two things together. I could have ended it, if I didn't want the story to be about trust, I could have just ended it in a slightly different way with a different bridge idea. Could have been about panic, panicking, and Go on then, Steve. It wouldn't be a 6-hole leaders call if we went through and you didn't.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever told this story, so I have no idea how it's going to turn out. But it spans the life of my working career. So my father was a lawyer, an immigrant from Hungary after the Second World War, and he was really keen for us to do well at school. So homework was a massive priority for him, not so much for me. My year 12 exam, I did really well in maths and science and ancient history, and pretty much failed the rest. Before my English exam, I went surfing instead of studying. So I didn't make it into, needless to say, I didn't make it into university. So my father said, well, if you're not going to go to university, get a trade. And so I became an electrician and was working for a council, electricity council, which was basically public service. And I got to the end of my apprenticeship and I just couldn't stand it anymore. So I started my own business, got taken to the cleaners by a developer. Which taught me a great lesson. My dad used to say to me, don't trust them. And I did. And they took me to the cleaners. And so then I ended up working I thought I'd do an engineering degree, electrical engineering degree, make amends for my past sins. I got halfway through that and decided, that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I switched to marketing. I got halfway through a marketing degree and decided that I knew more about marketing than the people that were lecturing me, because I'd been working for a number of years by this stage. But I was fortunate. I got engaged in the engineering company I was working with in sales. So I spent the next best, so probably the next 30 years of my career in and around sales. And I was very fortunate at the beginning to have a couple of mentors who taught me some really great principles about problem solving and helping people as a part of the sales process. And then so I went naturally, as you do, in the 80s, and I went from engineering, electrical engineering, into financial services, as you could. And we wonder why we have a Royal Commission into financial services in Australia. It was cowboy stuff. But I managed to work my way through it, got into some fairly large corporates, and went through the executive space, but not really at the top of the leading, senior executives. But I had some fairly significant businesses. The company got sold or taken over. 2 jobs. Sorry, 1 job, a check and a job. I got the check and I started my own business again. Did that for 10 years, and then got divorced and ended up in Papua New Guinea for 10 years working in HR. I could barely spell HR when I went up to Papua New Guinea. And through that period of time, my last role, I actually was working for an organisation. For 7 of those years, I was a contractor. For the last 12 months, I worked as a general manager for a property division within a construction company. And I basically, what it demonstrated was that years and years of being able to be adaptive and working in different scenarios, in different industries, in different continents, gave me the confidence to be able to lead a team of 120 people. And it was through that my lifetime of exposure that I was able to actually bring some value to the people that relied heavily on me, and I'm happy to say that they learned a lot from me.
So yeah, obviously adaptive and confidence were obviously words that came up for me, but that was maybe also because you mentioned them quite close to the end. And actually, if you were creating a written version of that, I would probably end the story. If you're talking about confidence and giving, a business owner the confidence to, look to exit in 10 years if that's what they want. So perhaps confidence could be a bridge idea.
I wasn't sure where it was going to go, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a story where there's actually multiple threads running in there. If you were to write that, it would probably. So what I do in my training courses, I get people to map out the story on a timeline, where each of the major turning points, if you think about the timeline going from left to right, each of the major turning points is either an up on the timeline, as in something good happens, or it's a down, as in something bad happens. So you get this ebb and flow of positive and negative things throughout the story. I think for a business use case, you probably got too many ups and downs. So you probably just tell part of the story. So you got the part of the story where you're talking about your education. And I really got the sense of you kind of doing it your way and following your own path. Maybe being a bit of a renegade.
Definitely.
Yeah. And perhaps that's the I still see you as a renegade, but I think you harnessed it, maybe.
No.
No, perhaps not on the motorbike.
The crazier the better.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you could sort of segment out that section about education, and almost like it's quite clear that you took responsibility for your own learning after, because you got the contrast then of going surfing before an exam, and then subsequently, eventually thinking, oh no, I maybe need to take responsibility for this and figure it out myself, and not just accept what I'm being told by a marketing lecturer.
No, as I said, I've never thought about that sequence of ideas. So thank you.
Yeah, there's a dual step here. So the first step is to collate ideas without overly worrying about how you're going to use them, how it's going to fit into your marketing systems. That's a secondary step. The first step is having these ideas on the surface so that you've got the raw materials to work with. Otherwise, you'll end up with writer's block because you end up scrobbling around for ideas. And if you've opened a Google Doc or a Word doc or something and you haven't got these things to hand and you're not clear on what the one idea is, what the bridge idea is, you'll find that writing's too hard. I've probably been doing it long enough to be able to wing it, but for the average person, I don't recommend doing that. I recommend pulling together all of your stories and then kind of over time determining, okay, well, these ones might make it into the sequence I send after people, first opt into my world. It's natural for that series to evolve a bit. The other thing I just wanted to mention before I hand back to Evelyn is that I've been talking mostly about email in this presentation, but this isn't really just about email. Email happens to be a personal medium by nature that is well suited to marketing follow-up. So anyone who says that email is dead is misguided, I think. I've even heard pay-per-click people say recently that email is still the highest converting last touch media. As in people might opt in from LinkedIn or Google or somewhere or be a referral or something. But email is often the last thing people do before they then go and fill in the form to book in the call. So I think email is still the bread and butter. It's still the starting point. Yes, email open rates are historically lower than they have been, but what I've kind of found is that the people who really do have the problems that you solve will read emails, especially if you can, because the way I structure it is the emails in both the first sequence where you deliver the lead magnet and the E2 sequence where you place your lead incubator. Those emails go out every day. So in the first instance, you're kind of encouraging this regular reading habit. And what I found is that the people with the problem that you solve, who also share your values, will be like, will essentially experience you as a breath of fresh air. They'll be like, oh, where have you been? And that's what you want. So when they get on that call with you, it just means that you can hit the ground running, so to speak. However, I do think you can use your story in other formats in other ways. And it all draws on the same kind of body of raw material. So if you're creating a video or a webinar, a bit like this one, this presentation's been a little bit different because I've been specifically calling out the mechanics of each story rather than just telling the story. But you could, if you were preparing a 60-minute or a 90-minute webinar, you might pick 3 stories, one from each act, that then has a one idea that connects to the message you're trying to communicate at that point, because the people attending they'll remember the story more than the message, and they'll get the message from the story, if that makes sense. If you're like I am, I've got a long running project to create a good homepage video. I think that is a place you can leverage your story, probably with more emphasis on the revision in the middle of how you've come to your current understanding of the way that you solve your problem. If you were to self-publish a book, this is obviously all valid raw material, because my book, Simple Storytelling, has ended up being a couple of 100 pages. I actually think it's ended up being too long, but hindsight's great. But however, I have tried to make it as readable as possible by weaving stories in and out. And you don't just have a huge block of stories, because then that does become self-indulgent. You have a bit of story, bit of content, bit of story, bit of content. So the reader never really feels like, obviously the distinction between story and content is kind of arbitrary, and the reader should never feel like they're in the story section or they're in the content section. It's just you're telling a story to illustrate a particular point, and in the process making it eminently readable. Because a book can do you a lot of good, but if no one reads it, then it won't. Something I do with my clients is the starting point in pretty much all of my projects, whether people work with me on on a training basis or on a done for you basis is I spend a bit of time with them up front to speak to them about their story just in a conversation. What I then do as a starting point is I get the transcript of that and I put all of the stories that you might have told me into a database with some proposed one ideas. I'm like, okay, this is the section of the transcript where you told me this story. These were the possible one ideas. I then put an AI edited section of the transcript onto the record, so that if you are creating an email, creating an article, creating a LinkedIn newsletter or something, you've got a body of raw material to copy and paste into your Word doc, so that you never have to face the blank Word doc again. Various different service levels and price points for that. If you'd like to talk to me about how that works, you can book a free story planning call. I'll put the link to that in the chat in a sec, but it's storysellingLab.co.uk/story-planning. That's just an initial call to kind of gauge, okay, for your business, what is the storytelling use case and where are you right now? What might you need? And then if you want help with that, I can quote for that on the back end of it. That is the end of what I have to say. So I will hand back to Evelyn and just say thank you very much for attending, and I hope it's been interesting.
Thank you, Rob. That was really interesting. I want to, first of all, open up to the room and ask you if there's someone that's got like a story that's sort of sitting in their mind that they've thought of after listening to all of this, and it's just like you're not sure what category it's in, or maybe you just want to ask a question about it. Now's your chance. Like, feel free to share the story, ask Rob. Oh, yeah. We are open. And then we'll get into the highlights and learnings. But I know what it's like when you're in a class like this, and then you've got these ideas, and then there's something sitting there, but you're just not sure, and you're like, oh, that you're doubting, you might be judging it. Feel free to open up and ask Rob while he's here.
I have a maybe like more general question about the nature of the stories. So, of course, you being a storyteller, it's kind of expected that you can bring in very personal story from your history, past, parents, etc. Now, if you talk about and have a webinar about, let's say, IT services or any basically business topic, I hear many times like client stories, kind of war stories, what you have been through, and then how you help them, etc. But do you think it's still appropriate place to start with the type of stories that we heard today that are very personal, while being in this very business setup or IT setup, which by definition is more dry and technical?
So there are 4 types of stories you can tell in your marketing. The first is product stories of how the product came into existence. Second is customer stories of people who've been through your program, worked with you. This is what they were worried about before. This is what they experienced. This is the outcome that they achieved. The third is personal stories. The fourth is what I call other stories. So it's telling stories about other things that have happened in history in other parts of the world, or things that didn't directly happen to you, but might still be relevant to your message. So yeah, so for IT services and people, what I see a lot of these kind of customer stories being used on webinars, and it usually precedes the call to action. As in, you might have a call to action at the end of the webinar, and you have some customer stories just before it. I think it's a perfectly legitimate use of a story in that it's very directly relevant to the product, but it's only going to be of interest to people who are thinking about working with you. So if you go back to the if we go back to the storytelling boomerang model, they're people who are in the buyer's market, not the waiting market. So at that point, you're saying, okay, well, who's interested in solving this problem right now and has the interest in doing so? And there will be some people. The question is are there enough of those people? Or do you have a bigger waiting market who you need to stay in contact with for a long period of time? If you need to stay in contact with them so in my business, I have potentially quite long sales cycles, as in people can opt into my world. I actually don't like it when they become leads very quickly because it's often symptomatic of them being bad clients to work with. It's actually better if there's at least a sort of 7-day window between them opting in and becoming a lead. But it can be months and even years that they sit on my list and eventually they raise their hand. And the longer that period is, potentially, between them first discovering you and first responding to your time-based offer or your next step offer, I do think there's a use for personal stories. In structuring that webinar, if you're presenting an IT services webinar, I think I would still keep the customer story just before the call to action. But I would also think about, well, what's one personal story that you could tell that illustrates what can go wrong by ignoring certain things? Because then what you're doing is you're selecting a story that illustrates the key insight, and the key insight is something that your ideal prospect will have missed. So you're shining the light of insight on a key insight, but you're telling a story to illustrate how that has impacted you in the past. So I would still tell, I think in that setting, I would still tell stories that were quite directly related to things that you've experienced at work or how you got into your current work. I would still make it quite closely related to the offer in that sense. It's more in the email follow-up sequences where you want to be a bit more personal. The use case for having more personal stories goes up if people work directly with you. If people just work, if you're a company and you've got a team, I mean, you might have some stories from the founder in that case, and people will still remember stories from the founder. I was involved, like Evelyn, I was involved in a company called Infusionsoft for a long time, and a lot of people in that community stayed because the founder, a guy called Clayton Mask, told very good stories and was very compelling. And people bought into that. So you got this, you got the message from the founder and communicating why the company does what it does. But I think you maybe wouldn't place those in if it was a technical IT webinar. Maybe you wouldn't place those at that point. So you might place them after an email opt-in, for instance. Those are just my shoot from the hips responses, I guess. But that in thinking about the use case and how you use these things, that's probably where I would go with it.
Thank you.
Rob, I've got a two-part question. You said there's 4 storytelling types. Do you mix and match them, or do you tend to, if you're talking about a product, you stay with a product, or do you mix up maybe a custom story with a product story? The second part of the question is analogies. So, taking this, and this might be the other topic where you're taking, maybe something from history or an event or a movie or something like that, and then you use the message that was in that story and you apply it to a service that you offer.
Yeah, I'll address the second part first about analogies. And so when I'm assembling someone's story into the database, there's often some things that they tell me where it's not really a complete story, but it's a nice anecdote that illustrates something. And it's maybe that you would always pair it with something else. So often and especially that becomes especially true when you start to gather. I mean, one way of gathering things like that is also to maintain a document of useful quotes that you've come across as well. I actually have 3 separate Google Drive documents of quotes that I've stolen from various people and fields.
It's called R&D, Rob.
Yeah.
Rip off and duplicate.
Yeah, that's it. So anyway, obviously, if you're able to reel off somebody's quotes on demand, it makes you sound very clever. But it's just really a case of making a note of them. So there'll be stuff like that you can pull in, and again, it just illustrates what you're saying. But yeah, it's not a complete story. But you might still have those as part of the database, or you might have like a quotes database as well of interesting things people have said. The first part of can you mix and match product and so product and customer stories do lend themselves to this because they're different sides of the same coin. For product stories, it's how the product itself came to be and things that have gone into the product and why certain features of the product work in the way that they do, and maybe even iterations of the product, times it's blown up and changes that you made to it. The customer story then is how the customer experiences that. I think customer stories are quite useful when placed to a call to action. I think they're also often done quite badly. Often they're just done as "wasn't it wonderful" type sickly sweets. Like it doesn't. Often I read them and go, "Well, was that really was that really the full picture?" Like I want to know, like, because something has always gone wrong. Especially if you run a service where you work with people for like 12 months, it's like it's not all going to be plain sailing. Like there's going to be challenges that come up, and I want to know about the challenges. I want to know what they were, and I want to know how you as a service provider responded, and told in the customer's voice. That becomes very powerful. The other thing that I try to get people to do with customer stories is to say, what were you worried about before you signed up for this service? So before I signed up with Steve, I was worried that he'd just be another business consultant, or yeah, whatever it is. So, but you're echoing objections that other people who come across this will have, even if they don't verbalize it. But then you say, but then I found that the experience was this. So you go from this before to after. You don't just jump straight to the after, which is what I think most people do. So yeah, I have a bit of a disinclination towards customer stories, but I think my disinclination stems from the fact that I think most of them are dull and expected and not always even necessarily believable. I'm also the type of person, who if I'm buying something from Amazon, I never look at the reviews. Like the star ratings hold no interest to me. Like I don't, I'm not. So I think I have a natural inclination to like hear someone's personal story of like why they created that thing, rather than hear some customer stories of the experience with that thing. And that's just where I sit on that spectrum, and other people will sit in other places. So I do acknowledge that as well. But I think you need both. I think there's a use case, definitely a use case for both.
That's really interesting. I think we all got
The
something there. That's really great. No.
if I can just point out one more thing, in chapter 4 of Simple Storytelling, I talk about the roles you need to fill to build out this kind of marketing follow-up system, to build a marketing system where you nurture new potential clients authentically and at scale. And the roles are, firstly, the business owner, which is probably going to be you. Unless you're a marketing manager or something, it's going to be you. The second role is the copywriter, is the person who actually puts the words to the page. The third role is the systems expert, is the person who really understands your marketing automation tool or your email platform and can get the most of it and knows how to. So with the system I showed you earlier, people opt in for the lead magnets. There's then a service offer. There's then, the systems expert can visualize all of that and knows how to connect the marketing automation system to your time booking widget and can do all of that and can tag people when they've clicked on it. And so you need someone like that as well to really get the most out of it. In my business, I play all 3 roles. I'm the business owner and a copywriter, and I'm a systems expert. It might be that in 10 years, I maybe no longer sit in a systems role, that maybe I work with someone else who can get the most out of Go High Level, which is my email marketing tool. But initially, you're probably going to sit in all three roles, but you probably just want to have a think about, should you be doing your own writing? Is it a good use of your time? It's because it's one thing anyone can talk through their stories verbally. And actually, all of my clients find it much easier to talk through their stories than to write their stories. And I would say that 90 to 95% of humans probably fall into that camp. I'm in the weird 5% of people who kind of prefer to write it, because writing for me is thinking, and I think by writing. Which maybe isn't 5%, maybe it's a bit bigger than 5%. But for most business owners, it's easier to talk. So then the question is okay, you can talk through your stories. Should you be writing them? Or do you need someone in the copywriter role? It's fine if you want to write it, but you've got to make time for it. You've got to really commit to it. Which is why also, final thing, which is why also my clients generally are publishing new content on a fortnightly basis, because it's a nicer production schedule for creating basically creating 2 good pieces of content each month that hopefully will have a story element in illustrating that piece of content.
Thank you. Any other questions for Rob? There'll be many questions, but you just want to like steal him and like have him come and sit in your business for a few days and write all your stories. I love working with Rob. I love listening to him, and his knowledge about this is just brilliant. And I love the way, Rob, you can draw the dots between things and unpack things really logically and systematically and verbalize it in that way. So thank you.
Every client I've ever had has told me that I'm logical, and it drives me mad because I don't see it, but that's what everyone else says. So be it.
That's great. All right. A few links if you want to get in contact with Rob, check out his website. So I will just pop these in the chat for everybody. And there you go. So there's the website, the LinkedIn URL, and email if you want to send him an email. There you go. Thank you so much, everyone. So we're at the end. Rob, you're great, as always. And everyone else here, you were great too. Thank you for your questions and sharing and being here. And yeah, I wish you all the best with your story writing, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
If you have got a lot from this session, just send us a quick message. Just let us know what you got from it. Just helps for potentially promoting future versions of this event.
Absolutely. If you're on Rob's list, or if you're on my list, or if somewhere you got an email from us, just hit reply and let us know what you got from the event. That would be wonderful. Yeah, much appreciated. Well,
thank you, Rob. Thank you, Evelyn.
Thanks,
thank
guys.
you.
See ya.
So much.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Aid.